Hello, and welcome to another episode of Chatter, a podcast from The Gist, with me, Josh Hamilton. Pól Torbóid from Lasair Dhearg was our guest on today's show. We talked about the founding of Lasair Dhearg, their desire to bring Ireland together in a 32-county socialist republic, the need for governments to admit that socialism actually works, and how their year of activism has been disrupted by COVID-19. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast and to our mailing list. And don't forget, my book, BREXIT, The Establishment Civil War, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. You'll find the link in the description below. So, here's Pól. Pól, thank you very much for appearing on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Not a problem. So, you're going to have to forgive my Irish pronunciation. How do you pronounce your organization? Because I've only read it and I am terrified to butcher the name.
No problem. It's a common theme. Lasair Dhearg is the pronunciation.
Okay, I would have definitely butchered that, so that's a good start. So, do you want to start with your story of how you discovered the organization and maybe give us like a little overview of what your goals are and things like that?
Yes, definitely. Lasair Dhearg came together. It would have been early to mid 2017. So we've been operating a few years now. What sort of happened was there was a group of political and community activists had sort of coalesced and were active in different things in the community, and there was a bit of an organic process there. You know, when you're involved in political and community activism, there's a group of people that have come together and you're getting active on different things. It's best to apply a name to that, you know, and when you apply a name to that and you have different aspirations beyond just local activism, you want to grow an organisation and build something across Ireland's 32 counties, having a name, a label, broader political aspirations, as you build in the public domain. So for us, early to mid 2017, a group of people had come together. We were active in the local community in West Belfast, and we decided very early on that we wanted to have a broader political platform. One of the things we had noticed from activism over many decades was that organisations, when they don't have their political colours nailed to the mast very early on, it can cause issues further on in the organisation where you're having all sorts of debates, and the outcome of that can sometimes be division. So what we decided to do very early on was nail our colours to the mast, and we developed a 10-point political programme which sort of provides it's our political programme. It provides our ideological definition, what we hope to achieve in a 32-county socialist republic. Everything right down to everything from education, health, housing, down to bodily autonomy and women's health, equality, and so on. So it's a fairly concise document that was put together very early on. The only thing that is missing from it is a drugs policy, but I understand our membership are sort of considering how do you approach that at the present time. Hopefully we'll see the result of that in due course. So we wanted that political programme very early on because it meant that anybody that was coming into the organisation when we eventually opened up membership, it wouldn't, they would be on the same page as us. They would be building the same project. They would have the same aspirations and stuff like that. So that was one of several documents we put together very early on before we opened up membership. The next document after that was strategy. You know, it's important that you have a strategic approach to your political programme as well. And so we soldiered through all those over the course of 1 to 2 years. And it wasn't until, over the course of a year, it wasn't until early to mid 2018 that we actually opened up membership. No, 2019, sorry, that we actually opened up membership. And so over the past year, we've been proactively building the organisation, and we do aspire to have eventually in the next number of short years a very national organisation spread over as much as Ireland's 32 counties. So that's sort of a summary of where we've come from and a bit of an indication as to where we hope to be going.
Okay. Are you hoping to stand for the Assembly and for the Parliament down south? Or in the Free State? I don't know how you would describe it. Maybe down south isn't the right way to put it.
Well, it's I won't berate you for your terminology, but no, we have no aspirations to stand in elections. Elections up until this point have never focused in any of our conversations. We're a political movement. Doesn't necessarily mean that we have to engage in the mainstream political process. We acknowledge that we're not a mainstream organisation yet. But no, we've no aspirations for our elections. They don't factor into our strategic goals at this time.
Okay. So how would you, for someone who say isn't that interested in politics or hasn't like experienced what like a grassroots movement might look like, how do you intend to make your case to the public and to try and build momentum for the 32 county socialist republic that you're aiming for without standing in elections? Like, what's your plan there?
Well, when you examine the mainstream political process, you'll actually find that as much as it's defined as democratic, it's not necessarily a completely democratic process. Especially in the 6 counties, when you examine the political process here and how political parties operate. I mean, if you consider that it's actually a minority of people that vote, if the voting age is restricted to those above 18, at that, it's not a majority, or sorry, it's not everybody is registered to vote. And then the voting is usually done by a majority of those registered. So you have this constantly reducing pool of people that are actually voting, and then their political views, or rather who they vote for, are what defines the political process. But setting all that aside, even those that take their seats in Stormont, they're massively restricted by the structures that are in place there. The petition of concern being a major one. When you consider that the rights for the LGBT community had been evaded for years, in terms of marriage equality, when you consider that the rights for women in terms of access to adequate healthcare and control of their own bodies had been evaded for years as well. And it actually had taken it to get to the point where Stormont wasn't sitting anymore, where Westminster could legislate on behalf of the 6 counties and sort of enforce the outcome. And I suspect that it was an outcome that a lot of the DUP knew that they had to stand against if it were to be brought to Stormont. But I would suspect that a number of them, possibly Arlene Foster herself, was almost happy to see it enacted by Westminster, so it was an issue that she didn't have to deal with. So the political process for me is in the 6 counties in particular is basically institutionalized sectarianism. What it has done is serve to maintain the division in the 6 counties beyond the Good Friday Agreement. So for me, personally speaking, all it's done is pass the issue on to another generation, and the failure to resolve the real constitutional issues, the real rights in the Good Friday Agreement have just delayed the inevitable.
So you think the structures put in place, like the system of consociationalism, I hope I've said that right, and Dehont, and the way that we've set up with a mandatory coalition with the largest unionist and nationalist parties, you think that's just essentially meant that it's impossible for us to move on from that entrenched community feeling that we've had for 40 years? Like, are you saying that those structures are the very reason that we haven't been able to move on?
I would argue completely, yeah, that would be the case. I mean, look at the 26 county state in the south there. I mean, Protestantism existed there pre-partition. Orange Order existed. Loyalism existed. When British kings came to Dublin, there was crowds out to meet them with Union Jacks and whatever else. So that feeling of loyalism or unionism, there would have been a large proportion of that in the South, but having resolved to a degree the constitutional issues, so to speak, removing the institutionalized sectarianism, there's an argument there, I think, that resolving partition is the only way to resolve sectarianism across Ireland's 32 counties. You know,
I haven't heard anyone make that case before. That's an interesting point. Like, do you think that socialist ideas especially in the 6 counties are really viable? Like, I don't, because personally I don't get the feeling that we've got a real sense of class consciousness in Northern Ireland, at least. I can't speak to the rest of Ireland because I just don't spend enough time with enough people from the Republic to really like get a grasp on what the feeling is. But like my impression of Northern Ireland was always that we're just not that class conscious.
Yeah, the difficulty is that you don't have a united working class across the board. You're starting to see some movement. You'll see a sort of working class unity in certain trade union fights and whatever else. But it would seem to me that most, or a large part rather, of the class consciousness has a tendency to be wrapped up in sectarianism as well. Which is a real pity, you know. But that again is, from what I can see, an outcome of the state. You know, you're voting for green or orange, and that tends to reflect upon your working class politics.
Do you think that it's even like viable to suggest that they could, like, that people could vote, like that the options are there to vote for non-sectarian parties, but you know we just have chosen not to? Like, is it a case that we enjoy, maybe not enjoy, but that we're just fine to accept the sectarianism as broadly? Like, we just sort of get no one stands up and says this is the election in which we're going to reject sectarianism, apart from the Alliance Party and the Green Party. Everyone else just goes like full for it. And we accept that, vote for it, and give our consent for it. Or would you argue that we're not truly giving consent for it due to the low turnout?
I mean, it's easy for different people to sort of step back and look upon it. You know, those that aren't engaged in the process and easily identify sectarianism or bigotry or whatever else. But for a lot of people here, the issue here is identity, and from that sectarianism can flow. And there is a rise. I mean, you've noticed in West Belfast in particular, there is a rise of a different kind of politics, absent of the mainstream narrative. You've seen the likes of Jerry Carroll, who I understand was on your show before.
Yeah.
You've seen the rise of his organisation. He's now an MLA himself. A number of councillors within the party in West Belfast. I mean, to state that 10 years ago that would be the case, or rather 15 years ago that would be the case, you'd have been laughed out of West Belfast. But he's managed to dig out a hole of support in one of the largest Republican areas in Ireland. So there is a case there that you know, there is a generation coming through that or younger. I mean, you look at Jerry Carroll, he's about early 30s, and most of his organisation is around the same age or lower in the 6 counties, or particularly in West Belfast. And they do good work on the ground. So you can see that people are starting to set aside the simple green and the simple orange arguments. Jerry, I'm sure, would argue that he is a Republican, a socialist himself. I'll let him make that case if he likes. Of course, I'm not trying to speak for him, but you can see that rise of alternative politics here, and the Alliance Party would be another one as well, as you've mentioned. So, but again, I mean, when you look upon all that as a whole, what's largely been achieved through all that? I mean, what has the political process achieved for normal working class people in terms of their bills?
Very little.
You know.
I mean, you could argue that it's been very little for a very long time. that our current setup has failed us, which it kind of draws me towards something I was wanting to discuss. So, in this hypothetical scenario, say we are 15 or 20 years down the line and you've been really successful in spreading your ideas and your thoughts, and you're looking at a position where you have to try and restructure the neoliberal like free market economy that we have now dealt with for the past 40 years that's been slowly built up. So how do you reform that? Like, where would you go if you had just complete free reign and to restructure the economy? Like, what would you guys do?
Well, as you know, we're a socialist Republican organisation, so that sort of defines our economic outlook in terms of a 32 county socialist republic.
But right, okay, so how far would that go into? Because some people will hear the word socialism and jump straight to like, oh, Karl Marx reincarnate, or and some people will hear socialism and they'll think just very incremental little tiny things like, okay, maybe the NHS or public transport being nationalized. And just, there's a big scope there. Like, how far would you guys go?
There is and this is a debate that I've had often. I mean, to speak more specifically, I mean, I would define myself as a Marxist-Leninist. It doesn't mean that I'm sort of an academic or well tuned in to all the political theory and have read all the books. I haven't, but it is the ideological position that I've arrived at most points. Marxist-Leninism, it's sort of it manifests itself in Ireland as socialist republicanism, and that's sort of the best definition that I can give. But there's a massive debate there to be had in terms of definitions. I mean, one thing to one person can mean something completely different to another. One of the biggest public fights in terms of definitions that's happening at the minute is anti-fascism. Everybody's against the Nazis. We're all anti-fascists. But Antifa, or Antifa, as the word, the buzzword that's being thrown about today, is being used to, denigrate a whole sort of loose coalition of people with a single mind in terms of fighting fascism and sectarianism. They're being branded with this hate symbol, Antifa. So that definition of Antifa and Antifa, it's the same thing, but it's completely different things to different people in terms of, depending on the conversation that's being had. So the same thing can apply to socialism, to republicanism, or so socialism, like you said, it is a massive, there is a huge broad scope there. You're starting from social democracy, the democratic socialism, all the way up to communism. Our organisation would put ourselves firmly on the left. So when it comes to the economic processes in society, it's our position that those processes are governed and managed by those that will benefit from them the most. That would be the ruling class. And so we would like to put those processes in the hands of the biggest class in society, which is the Irish working class. My main concern with economics, right, from a Republican perspective, is that obviously as a Republican, we're democratic. We want to see democratic structures across the island. But why should that democracy stop when it comes to the economy? So what we're arguing for is a democratic economic process where the largest amount of people possible have the biggest say in terms of the economic ebbs and flows. If you look at housing in particular in Ireland, and the cost of housing and inflation, supply and demand. I know you'd mentioned before neoclassical economics, supply and demand and the free market and stuff like this. That only serves to make those that are rich richer. And in order to do that, it must impoverish the rest of us. So when it comes to the likes of housing, and you talk about what that might look like in a 32 county socialist republic, we want to remove the profit motive from those economic processes. So, water is a good example here, where water is managed by the state. Now, you can make all sorts of arguments about how effective it's managed and whatever else. I think it's managed well for the most part. We can drink our water here. It's clean most of the time when there's not a scare. But if that was in the hands of a private company, their first motive would be to reduce costs. So they would be sort of maybe not investing in the proper pipework expansion. They would only be expanding in the areas where it's profitable. Broadband is a good example of that. There's insufficient coverage across a 6-county state. I believe there was a headline there this morning that's identified that. I can't remember the figures, but I'm sure that during the coronavirus crisis and people trying to work from home, that it's been highlighted massively. So it would seem in that case that Jeremy Corbyn was right. Not that I'm a massive supporter. Let me just add that caveat. But there's clearly an argument for the state to manage critical resources, particularly water, broadband. Why not electricity? Why not bring electricity into the hands of the public domain? So one thing that really bothers me, right, when you look at housing across Ireland, it makes sense for any business person to acquire land, to build a house on it, and to sell it for profit or for rent. It makes sense. In fact, those arguments are oftentimes put forward by even the banks. Rent to buy loans or buy to rent loans or build your own home. The economic processes are oftentimes put in the hands of massive developers, and it's up to them to bring forward critical resources like housing. The figures we run about 18 months ago now, bear in mind they're a little bit old, but I would imagine they're not much different. Across both failed states in Ireland, you have 119,000 people without a home, families without a home, one or the other, significant number anyway. But across both failed states, you have 200,000 empty houses. So if the will was there, you could literally solve Ireland's housing crisis at the stroke of a pen. But the will is not there because they've decided that it's more important for people other than those that need them to own those homes. The housing economy is a large section of the economic processes in the 6 and 26 county states. And the outcome of that, when we have the ebb and flow in capitalist economies, when we have downturns, etc., the outcome of that is massively detrimental because of inflation, inflated costs, additional profit, the property bubble, and so on. So we know that capitalist economics doesn't work. It works for 5, 10, 15 years. It works for the rich. And then when we have an economic downturn, we apply socialism. For want of a better word, it's not actually socialism, but it's those types of processes that's applied to it in order to save the economy. And really what they're saying there is, we know socialism works. We can apply it here when we need to, but when we don't need to, we want the rich to get richer. So in short, we need to look at housing. We need to look at the electricity system, the water system, all those social requirements, and they need to be brought under the public good so that we can administer them for ourselves. And housing in particular, the amount of profit applied to housing. If you consider in the south, there was figures run in the last few years there where it costs £180,000, I think, to build a house. A house is typically built over 32 weeks in order to maximize its profits. A house can be built much quicker than that, as we know. But that house would then go on. This is your typical 3-bed house. It would then go on to be sold for €330,000. A significant amount of profit. So if somebody's getting a mortgage on €330,000, what they're actually paying over the 25 years is significantly more than that. You could be talking £500,000 easy, with the APR and stuff. If that property is then sold on and then another mortgage is applied, banks can be making millions off one home, and that money is all extracted from the people to the banks, sent offshore into somebody's bank account. And so what you actually have then is an economic process which extracts as much wealth as it can from every county in Ireland, sends it offshore so it isn't retained in-house for local use. Contrast that with the coronavirus crisis. And what the government's actually done was put as much money as they could in the hands of normal working people, because they know that the more money you put in the hands of consumers, the more likely an economy is to succeed and to grow. So by putting the money in the hands of people that needed it, that were going to spend it locally, in local stores, in the local businesses, they retained a process where the economy sort of edged forward and kept alive during the crisis. And there's a reason that because of that, the next downturn hasn't happened. When they start to remove those support mechanisms, we'll start to see the next downturn, I would imagine.
I mean, we've already seen like a pretty huge economic shock in April, May time. I think it was, I don't know what the figure for the Republic of Ireland was, but the UK economy shrank by 20%. It was like 20 years worth of growth just gone in like 2 months. And well, obviously the stock market isn't a good metric of like a measure of the health of an economy. But I think your point is right that it's like we've seen a little bit of like after the initial shock, it's been fairly steady, just like slowly ticking upwards. But it's not what you've said is quite true. I think in that as soon as the furlough scheme ends and the loans start to be called back and suddenly the money from and the support starts to dry up, we're gonna see a lot more economic hardship. But I want to ask about you something you talked about housing there. How would you solve that housing program? Do you guys have like a program? Would it be an empty house tax in the same way they have in Toronto and Vancouver, I think I'm aware, and it's been pitched in London? Or would you suggest that in a true socialist republic that you wouldn't actually have that much home ownership? Would it be a lot of renting, or would it be social housing? Like how would you solve that issue? Just I'm curious.
Well, our position on housing is very simple. We don't believe, I mean, housing is a human right, okay? So we don't believe that anything that is a basic human right should be allowed to be profited from. So that applies to healthcare, housing, and so on. So we want to see profit completely removed. We want that motive completely removed from the housing system. That means that nobody is allowed to own a house to rent it in order to make profit. It means that nobody's allowed to own an additional home so long as somebody is homeless. I mean, you look at those figures across both failed states. If we were in government tomorrow, not that that's going to happen, but you know, if our organisation over the next 20 to 50 years or whatever it is, takes control across 32 counties, we would be requisitioning all housing, bringing it onto the public good, and then the community can decide who lives where. You know, so it will be a new economic process removed of the profit motive. It will be a service rather than a business, and at a local level, local institutions can decide. You know, you could have them, it could be community networks, could decide who lives in which street, obviously with caveats for no discrimination and all this type of stuff. And so, you know, as democratic a process as possible, absent of the profit motive, where housing is put directly under the control of the people as a human right.
So how do you get to this economic democratization? So you've said that your goal isn't, especially initially, for sure, not to stand for Parliament either side of the border, and so how do you get to that process of economic democratization? Say you have like enough supporters, and someone said, okay, we want you to figure out how you're going to do this. Like how would you govern for, or how would you take like polling of the opinion of the country? Like how would you basically like get that figured out? Would you use a citizens' assembly? Would you be interested in like direct democracy, or what would be your thoughts on how to get there?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I'll have to choose my words carefully here. We don't want opinion polls. If there's an injustice in the world and something's not right, it just needs fixed. You know, we don't need to go and garner mass opinion to see if everybody else agrees with us. The housing system's broken. You know, in my constituency here, West Belfast, some of the latest figures, I don't know if it's in West Belfast or across the six-county state, but 18,000 families um, on the housing register. That to me is, that's the fact that that's been, that's all my life. I remember those conversations, people trying to get on housing waiting lists or struggling to pay rent. The housing system's broken. We don't need to go and look for other opinions in terms of what people think about that. It's clear as day. I think there's only one solution, and that's that the housing system should be seized. So our approach at this point is to build a mass movement of people. Now, whether or not we're going to be the ones to do it, that's absolutely up for debate, but we'll be following a process year by year where our aim at this point is to build an organisation, a mass movement of people that will, in the likes of West Belfast, take a serious look at housing and sort of make decisions themselves about what they think housing should look like and sort of get active on that. If in 10 years' time we had a very large pool of people in one area, we would start to seriously look at building alternative structures within the community, alternative systems of control, absent of the state. And that would be our strategic objective in terms of building the organisation to get to that point and sort of building the socialist republic. We don't view the state, all revolutions are about seizing the state apparatus in order to effect economic control. Our position and our strategic outlook is that we can seize economic control at a local level and therefore seize the state. So we've actually flipped that completely on its head. And from what I can see, there's nobody else out there at the moment speaking on those terms. So our outlook is somewhat different than all other organisations. We actually seek to seize housing at a local level in order to seize the state. It's a very summarised way of putting it, but housing will be one of our major objectives when we build our mass movement here. We'll be looking in areas like West Belfast. So if there is an empty house and nobody's using it, or we know who it belongs to and it's not being utilised for the benefit of the community, we will be very seriously looking at that in terms of creating better outcomes.
So your ultimate goal would be to create like a patchwork of localized little, I don't know, councils or whatnot throughout each, say, borough, rather than like a mass, like more sort of federalized, like 32 county wide specific movement? Like, would you be more, you'd be more focused on giving small individual areas their autonomy rather than like one big sweeping reform?
As part of a strategic process to seize a state, yes. So we believe that building small autonomous areas in working class districts will allow us to build an organisation or a movement rather to seize the economic processes at a local level. Then you work your way up, you build that up from streets to districts, estates, to towns, to cities, and then that links up and creates a state within a state. So we actually think when looking at that in those terms, it's very hard work, but it doesn't mean that we're marching in columns up to Stormont or Leinster House to seize the state apparatus. Rather, we're using democracy at a local level and using people's wishes and outcomes and rights and needs to build something new, street by street. It'd be a lot of hard work. It's a massive aspiration. We don't doubt it for 1 second, but we think the will's there. And if we commit to that over the next 5, 10 to 20 years, those are the terms upon which we're talking, I've no doubt that the possibility to build something is there.
Now, something that I came across whilst reading about the 2016, this is going to seem unrelated, but I promise it is, okay? So, something I came across when I was reading a book called Fallout by Tim Shipman. It was written about the year in British politics from the Brexit referendum, just the next 12 months as far as I can remember. It's a fantastic piece of work, and it's a really interesting inside look in some cases at what was going on in Jeremy Corbyn's camp through the 2016 election and his like the takeover of momentum and the sort of left of the party over those like year or two from 2015 to 2017. And something that the author commented on, and I'd not actually heard it put quite like this, was the difference between left-wingers in the Labour Party that were joining, especially young people, was the difference between the Lenonist and the Leninist. So there was the Leninist, or the Lenonist, like with an O, like as in the Beatle, were very much like just sort of young. They weren't like particularly politically engaged before, but they liked what Jeremy Corbyn was saying. They liked his vibe, and they would have been pretty happy in like the 60s and Summer of Love, versus like the Leninists, who would consider themselves to be like more militaristic almost in their kind of like commitment to the left-wing cause. People would hold them, maybe John McDonnell up as an example of someone like this. He's like a very sort of not so secret Marxist.
Yeah.
Do you see that being something that you've noticed in your work in building this organization and community that you've started to do? Have you found that you've seen like a similar distinction, or are people more, I don't know, sort of together on their view of how the world should be, from what you've encountered anyway?
Well, I think I see the point that you're making, and I'll summarize it thus. I had a conversation with a comrade there in recent weeks about, obviously, our organisation. We opened up our membership there in early 2019, just last year. We have had a growth in membership based on our activism. Our membership of activists in Belfast has almost doubled in the last year.
Oh, congratulations!
And we're now having growth in Cork, Limerick, Derry applications coming through in Dublin. Much of those applications are, from what we've seen so far, working class activists. But there is, from what I've noticed, there would be people that are coming through from universities. So far, I mean, the conversation I had with a comrade quite recently was that, give me 5 activists, give me 5 communists from a working class area over 50 communists from a university. I would choose the 5. So there is a strain when going through university. And so, it's easier to fall into politics, and much of that politics can be wrapped up in liberalism and Corbynism more recently, support for him and whatever else. But from what we've seen, no, even those coming from universities, particularly Queen's and Belfast, we haven't noticed that liberalism. Everybody has been on very much the same page as us in terms of socialist republicanism. So in short, no, I know what you're talking about, but we haven't noticed it with ourselves yet, I'm sure.
It's just, so you wouldn't back the critique of the left that maybe more broadly applies to the UK and the US, in that that it's become a bunch of middle class hippies.
I've heard that argument made plenty of times. I've seen a lot of it. It's liberalism dressed up in the language of socialism. It's a trendy lefty type thing. I mean, our organisation itself, just looking inward, is focused on activism. And the activism flows from the ideological position. So we've been largely absent of that. And if somebody became part of our organisation and weren't active, or just wanted the membership card, it doesn't really work like that. So when you come in and you're part of a branch, you're helping to build the organisation, and you're out there day and daily, doing what you can when you can. There's no pressure put on people. But if you don't tie in and you're not active on our ideological position or activism, whatever else, then it's not that you're set aside, but there are different areas of the organisation where you can go and provide your focus. So we have a large supporters network as well. So if it's not easy for you to tie in with a branch and stuff, you can go into the supporters network and give your time there on social media or whatever else, So largely, no. I mean, it's not. I mean, I know what you're talking about. I've seen it discussed a lot on social media. But in terms of ourselves looking inward, no, it's not something we've experienced yet.
Okay. So what are you working on at the moment? What are your sort of near-term goals? Is there projects you're running at the moment? Sort of say, like, what does the next 18 months look like for you guys?
Well, we declared at the start, 2019 was our year of foundation, so a lot of hard work was put in place before we opened up membership, and we continued that work throughout the year. 2020, we declared, was to be our year of activism. The last 6 months, we put a review video out there quite recently, has sort of shown how much activism we've put in with a very small group of people. We are a small organisation. So we're very activist focused, and on that basis, we have a number of campaigns which are designed to tie into our strategic objectives, which are to build mass, build the organisation, and build projects. Two of those campaigns are called Storm and Can't Deliver, for very obvious reasons, and then the other one is End Imperialism and the Occupation. One of the major issues, I think, at the moment is in terms of campaigning. It would seem that imperialism as the core issue here in the six counties has almost been set aside. It's such a given for socialist Republican organisations that activism on that level, sort of on the streets and sort of highlighting it and the processes of it and all that, is largely missing. So we wanted to expand upon that as much as possible and to build an actual campaign. That's happening quite slowly. The other campaign, like I said, is Storm and Can't Deliver. That encompasses everything in the six-county state, from housing, Storm and Can't Deliver, women's health, bodily autonomy, Storm obviously can't deliver, and so on. So that campaign is designed to embody all the issues with the six-county Storm and state, and sort of the funnel them into the campaign of highlighting the inadequacies. But from a core Republican perspective, in terms of a 32-county socialist republic, it's very obvious that Stormont can't deliver. And so those arguments need to be made again, sort of in terms of rebuilding the Republican base. So those are the two main campaigns that we've got. Our activists at the moment, there's a meeting scheduled here in the next week. We're bringing as many people together in the room to discuss housing. Obviously, it's been a huge focus in this conversation. Outside of this podcast, this interview, and wherever else, it's a huge focus for everybody. So housing, obviously, will become a huge part of our focus, I would imagine, in the next 6 to 12 to 18 months. What that looks like is to be decided by membership, but I'm sure it'll be the outcome of all the subject matter we've discussed here today in terms of rights and inadequate access to housing and more.
So, does COVID give us an opportunity, or is it? Do you feel it's given yourselves like a chance to bring in a lot of new people and get people thinking about new ways in which we can organize our society, our politics, and our economy? Do you see this as an opportunity, or do you think that once we start to go back to a bit of normalcy, that sort of feeling of the need for change will have dissipated?
Well, let's see. A massive gap opened up when the coronavirus happened. There was a spike in activism, that much is clear, across the board. So people being out of work and stuff. I mean, look at the Black Lives Matter protests across the globe. I think there's a bit of an argument to be made there that, in the absence of work, was there more people on the streets, and going back into a normal quote unquote work-life balance. Yeah. There's no doubt that will remove people from the street. They'll have less time to do other things. So I think that'll be an outcome that you'll see a reduction actually in the next few months in activism across the board from all organisations. That'll be one outcome. I don't think it'll be until the next inevitable proper downturn when we start to see the effects of that, and not just the effects, but the response from the state. I don't think it'll be up until that point that we'll actually see the actual political outcome or the activist outcome at a local level in response to that. There's no doubt that the Tory government and subsequently the Sinn Féin DUP government in the six counties, they're very much wedded to neoliberal economics.
Which is shocking for two grassroots parties. Like working class grassroots parties, like that's where they both came from.
Yeah. It just highlights their inadequacy when it comes to economics. Sinn Féin in particular would have defined themselves as socialist in the past, and that's a description that's been largely dropped, except maybe when it comes to a vote or two at local level, and they want to retain some support. But they're very much wedded. I mean, you just need to look at their special advisors, their economic positions up in Stormont, and I'm talking about Sinn Féin and the DUP, to see what their economic outlook or position is. The very fact that they were willing to acquire large loans from the British state in order to sack thousands and thousands of public service workers gives an indication as to where their heart lies in terms of workers, really, and that's all about, I mean, that's in the neoliberal outlook, that's all about reducing the state and letting private hands determine the processes in society in terms of supply, demand, wages, and all that, So there's only one direction that economic process can go, and that's just it's downturn after downturn, and that's what we're looking at here, because not just the failure of the Tory government, but the failure of the government in the 6-county state, and indeed the 26-county state, it leads to one inevitable outcome, which is downturn, which is austerity, which is political activism from the working class. So I would hope, based on your question, I would hope that organisations are much better prepared this time around. I mean, you have a generation of young people there that experienced the most recent downturn, and to say we're angry about it will be an understatement. So I would hope going into this next one with the very possible austerity measures brought in on top of what was there previously, that people will be a little more angry about it, and to say to do a wee bit more about it,
I get. Well, I hope you're right anyway, but that feels like a very nice positive note to leave things on. I have to do another call here in like 5 minutes, so I am going to have to
no problem.
But I really appreciate your time. That was really, really interesting to get to hear your perspective and sort of thoughts about where we might be headed in a utopian socialist republic coming forward, looking at us.
Yeah, fantastic, and thanks for having me. Just before I do go, I would advise people just to have a look at our website. It's lasairdhearg.com. A cursory Google search will help you find it. There's the Facebook page, the Twitter as well. Our activists also run a magazine as well called Anspreek. It's a Socialist Republican magazine. It's been out of print now, obviously, over the coronavirus crisis, but we do expect to have our next issue out in September. So if people can give that a wee look as well. Bit of a selfish plug there, Josh. But
this is the exact moment. I was gonna say, if there's anything you want me to put links for, just send them over to me, and I'll stick them in the show notes and whatnot, so anyone can find yourself, your Twitter, and anything else you want me to link in there. But yeah, it was an absolute pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me, Josh. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast and to our mailing list. And don't forget, my book, BREXIT, The Establishment Civil War, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. You'll find the link in the description below. Until next time, thanks for listening.